Alright, hi you guys. I'm about to start my presentation here. My name's Caleb Baumgardner. I'm going to fully admit I'm I'm pretty new to the whole video recording thing, so I'm trying my best here. I think it's going to work out fine. Let's get started here. So the presentation is about the legal rights and responsibilities as it pertains to special education. So talking about students, teachers, and then parents as well. Let's jump right on in. So the first question, the first requirement that we had to fulfill was to define what special education was. And I looked up some definitions online. I found some good ones. But the definition that the book provided was actually really good, and I liked it. So that's the one that I decided to use. I really couldn't reiterate it any better. It was I've got it right here. It says special education is a specially designed instruction to meet the unique needs of an individual recognized as exceptional. So it's broad, but I think it really it captures everything it needs to. It gives you the necessary information. And I apologize, I can't remember if this is the definition that's embedded in the text or the one that's back in the glossary. I think it's the one in the glossary, but I can't remember off the top of my head. I apologize for that. But anyway, yeah, talking about what special education is. It's special education. It's really in the name itself. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next slide now. So the next requirement that was set forth in the instructions, was to talk about the 6 principles of IDEA, and I'll talk about them a little bit more in detail in a second here, but just to get them out of the way, it's number 1, we've got a free, appropriate public education, the FAPE, the least restrictive environment, LRE. That's a really important one. It comes up a lot. Well, they're all really important, but that one is a point of contention currently. People are talking about. Moving on, though, next bullet point here, we've got an individualized education program, so that's the IEP. We've talked about that a lot. That's, again, really important. Procedural due process, and then non-discriminatory assessment, and then finally, parental participation. And we'll talk at length about that and what that looks like, what that means, everything that's involved with that. So moving on to the next slide here. This is when I start to go a little bit more in depth about the 6 principles of IDEA. And I thought about doing this later in the presentation, but I figured, we just stated them, so I figured I'll go ahead and talk about them a little bit more in depth right here. And we circle back a bit and talk about them a little bit more in detail later on. But let's get started here. A free, appropriate public education. So what that means, all children are afforded an appropriate education based on their circumstances at no cost to the parents or guardians. Just to restate it pretty much. And then I put here, the services are related to the child's unique situation. So this is important because before IDEA, this wasn't a guarantee. The schools did not have to accommodate students with special needs. They could be denied schooling based on that. So this really changed that, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So I'd like to go ahead and move on to the next principle now, and that is the least restrictive environment. And like I mentioned before, this one is super important. In the first bullet point here, I've got children with special needs should be educated in a general education classroom as much as is appropriate. And that has to do with their unique circumstances, and that kind of leads into my next bullet point here. Circumstances determine how much exposure is appropriate. The student's needs need to be kept in mind. So, as important as it is to make sure that the least restrictive environment is implemented for these students with exceptionalities, certain cases you're not always going to be able to have full integration into the mainstream classroom. It all depends on the situation, but the least restrictive environment is important. So maybe it's not full integration with the other students, but it's something along those lines. So I'd like to move on to the next one now. An individualized education program, the IEP. So what the IEP is, basically, is, well, literally, it's a document, and it's developed with the input from the parents of the student, and it's a plan to better educate the student. So the student has disabilities. The IEP is designed to accommodate for those disabilities and educate the student in the best way possible. And each of them each IEP is going to look different, because all the students are going to be different. Even students with the same label, the IEP is going to look different for each one of them, each case. But there are some required materials that need to be included in the IEP. So they're required to address several factors here. Okay, so current level of performance, pretty self-explanatory, where the student is, and then you've got annual goals and educational objectives. What's the student aiming towards, and what needs to be communicated? What does the student need to, the tools that the student needs to gain? Services to be provided. So, what services are going to be provided? How much the student will be exposed to the general education environment, and that goes along with my last slide with about least restrictive environment. It kind of goes hand in hand with that. This basically is just stating how much they're going to be integrated into that general ed classroom, and if they're not going to be in there full time, then what the environment is going to be. Then you've got plans for initiating services and duration of service delivery. And then finally, annual evaluation of the student to track progress. And that's important. Make sure that, to see if the student is progressing, see where they came from, where they're headed, what they've learned. Okay, we're going to go ahead and move on to the next slide now. And this is where we talk about procedural due process. And this is about the parents, basically, and about their rights as it pertains to their child's education. So I have down here some of the rights, some of the important rights, and there are more. This isn't an exhaustive list, but these are the ones that are important that I found. They have rights to confidentiality of records. That's important. They have the right to examine all the records. They have the right to obtain independent evaluation of their child. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the presentation, but I'm moving on here. They have the right to receive written notification of proposed changes in their child's classification or placement. And that's really important. There's got to be transparency on the part of the school in terms of what they're doing with the child. They have to keep the parents in the loop, so to say. They have the right to impartial hearing when disagreements arise, and that's disagreements with the school. I neglected to put that on there, but just to clarify. And then representation by legal counsel, obviously. Okay, let's move on to the next slide now. And this is non-discriminatory assessment. So before the child is placed, a multidisciplinary team must evaluate them. And what that multidisciplinary team looks like is teachers and administrators, school psychologists. One of them needs to be a teacher, though, and that becomes important later in the presentation. Next bullet point, tests cannot be racially, culturally, or linguistically biased, and that's really important. And we talked a little bit about this, I think, in some of the lecture slides, and I believe the textbook touches on this a little bit, about how there's overrepresentation of certain minority groups in special education, and, so is that because of linguistic barriers? Is it because of cultural barriers? So it's important that they state here that the tests can't be biased in any way. And then, of course, several assessments are required before placement. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide here, and that's parental participation. Again, very important. The idea requires that parents participate meaningfully in decisions affecting their child's education. And like I said before, transparency is a must by the school. The parents have the right to be involved, and they're actually required to be involved in a meaningful way. Okay, so I'd like to go ahead and move on now to the specific rights that each group has. And I'm talking about the students, the parents, and the teachers here. And I'd like to start off with the students. So some of the rights that the students have, as stated before, free and appropriate public education. And then moving down the list, we've got educated in the least restrictive environment. And, we've talked a little bit about both of those. The next one, services until the age of 21 for those who haven't completed high school. And in my research, I actually found that there are a couple exceptions to that. I think Michigan actually guarantees it up to age 26. And I don't know if there are any other states that are like that, but that was one anomaly that I found with that. But every state is required to provide those services up to age 21. And then you've got, they have the right to individualized education program, the IEP, and I have for eligible students, obviously. And then services stay in place during disagreements between schools and parents. So that's another important one. Okay, so I'd like to go ahead and move on. These are the rights of parents, and again, these lists are not exhaustive, but these are some of the key rights that each group holds. So, parents, due process when resolving conflicts with the schools, identification and evaluation at no cost to the parents. And that's within the school itself. I mentioned earlier that parents, they can seek a second opinion. I think I mentioned that. If not, I mention it later on in the presentation. That parents can seek a second opinion in terms of their children. That's not going to be covered. If you're going to a specialist private practice, you're going to have to pay out of pocket. But within the school, identification, evaluation, it's all free. Then you've got meaningful involvement of parents in all decision-making processes dealing with their child's education. Again, we've talked about that a little bit. They can be involved in that process. And then, of course, informed consent. And now I've got the teachers. So the teachers can request that a student be evaluated. If they notice something's going on, they think there might be something there, they can request that there be an evaluation. And the teachers aren't the only ones who can do that, of course, but they're included in the personnel who can do that. And then, of course, they're included in the IEP crafting, creating that individualized educational plan. And then I put continual involvement in the IEP, and that's not required anymore, and we get to that later on. But they certainly can be involved in it. And it's probably for the best that they are involved in it as much as possible. Okay, so the next requirement for this presentation was to talk a little bit about some of the laws that deal with special education. So I have down here relevant legislation, and I talk about a lot of the big ones here. And these are all mentioned in Chapter 2 of our textbook. I have here Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and I talk about that one first. I wanted to do them in chronological order. I think that that's the best way, so you can see how they all build on each other and they all evolve over time. So doing it in chronological order, I think, is the best way of doing that. First talk about Section 504, and then Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. That's IDEA. That's what we've been talking about. The 6 principles of that, and then also the reissues of that piece of legislation. And then I go into the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001, and then sort of the evolution of that, the Every Student Succeeds Act of 2015. And then, that's really all the relevant legislation. Those are the big ones, the really big ones, and those are the most important ones. So I'd like to go ahead and jump right into Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. You can probably guess what year it was passed. And this isn't an education law at its heart. It's actually a civil rights act. And so basically what it's all about is no individual can be denied access to a program or activity receiving federal funding because of a disability. So obviously that includes schools. So that's why it's relevant to what we're talking about. So it has a broader definition of what disabilities are than IDEA. And I talk about that in my 4th bullet point here. They use a functional model to determine eligibility here. Does the person have a mental impairment or physical impairment or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities? Do they have a record of such an impairment? Do others regard them as having an impairment? And those 3 bullet points there I got straight out of the book from the section talking about Section 504. And then circling back here, schools, because of this, schools have to make reasonable accommodations for students with disabilities. That was the major thing that came out of this law, and that leads a little bit into what we're going to talk about next, and that's the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA. We've already talked a bit about this, so I'll keep it brief on this one, but this one it's really important, so I think it is worth talking about a bit more. So it's seen as a Bill of Rights for children with disabilities. I got all 3 of these bullet points from the textbook, actually. I really liked the language that they used. It was a Bill of Rights for children with disabilities. I really liked that. Because, it really is. Signed into law by Gerald Ford, November 29th, 1975. And then you've got the purpose of the law right here. And, it was stated really well in the textbook, and I felt like paraphrasing it would be honestly kind of superfluous, just because of it. There was really no need to change any of the language or anything. So it's to assure that all handicapped children have available to them a free, appropriate public education, which emphasizes special education and related services designed to meet their unique needs, to assure that the rights of the handicapped children and their parents or guardians are protected, to assist states and localities to provide for the education of all handicapped children, and to assess and assure the effectiveness of efforts to educate handicapped children. So as you can see, it states it pretty bluntly. I didn't really want to try to rephrase it, so I just quoted it there. I thought they did a good job of it. So really admirable goals, and a really big piece of legislation that still affects us today. So to continue on, it does have the 6 principles, and we went over those. And it's been reissued a few times. And 1986 was the first reissue, and it really focused on early childhood. So I've got here Individualized Family Service Plan, the IFSP for infants and toddlers. And then Developmentally Delayed becomes an official label. Moving on to the reissue that happened in 1990, the related services that special education students can take advantage of are expanded to include social work and counseling. And then I've also got here autism and traumatic brain injury as discrete categories. And then finally on this page I've got the 1997 reissue, which disabled students are required to take part in state and district testing. That's pretty important. And that leads into what we're going to talk about next. But to finish this up, general education instructors are required to participate in IEP team. And that's actually amended later in the 2004 reissue of this, but we'll get to that whenever that comes up. And then goals and benchmarks are greatly emphasized. And that really goes hand in hand with the No Child Left Behind Act, which was the next big piece of legislation that we're going to talk about here. So it was a reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, and it was signed into law by George W. Bush, 2001, and then it was rolled out a little bit later. And it focuses on mathematics, reading, science, being proficient in all of those areas, and it focuses on all students. So obviously that includes students with exceptionalities, and it has a focus on standardized testing. We've got here grades 3 through 8 required to test annually, and then there needs to be at least once that they're tested in grades 10 through 12. And it's those subjects that I mentioned up there in the third bullet point there. So to continue on, one of the goals of this piece of legislation was to align general education and special education a little bit further, and that was to help cater to all students. And that would logic would dictate that would help with the least restrictive environment, to have a classroom that's able to accommodate all students. You're going to be able to expose students with exceptionalities to the general education curriculum if it's tailored to everyone. So then to move on, poor performing schools were provided with assistance, and that's technical assistance, financial assistance, things like that. And then parents are permitted to move their kids out of poor performing schools if they wish. They can move them to a private school or somewhere else, a different public school, wherever. And there's a real emphasis on highly qualified teachers, and highly qualified in quotation marks here. So to move on, the evolution of the No Child Left Behind Act was really this right here. I wanted to include this because this is pretty recent. It's the Every Student Succeeds Act, and our book touches on this also in Chapter 2. It, again, Reauthorization of Elementary and Secondary Education Act, so it's the same piece of legislation reauthorized. It's signed into law by Barack Obama on December 10th, 2015, and really the goals of this are the same as the No Child Left Behind Act, raising the bar, making sure that kids are proficient in everything, but it sought to fix some of the deficiencies in it. So it still requires annual testing, but it eliminates yearly progress provision in favor of a statewide accountability system. It also allows for state adoption of the Common Core standard, the Common Core state standards. That's a bit of a tongue twister there. And then it does away with the highly qualified teacher status, highly qualified within the quotation marks there. And then individuals with disabilities are guaranteed access to the general education curriculum, and they're also afforded accommodations on those state and district assessments, which is a big deal. That's a big deal. So, what does this mean for myself? I believe there was a requirement in the assignment description to talk about what this meant for your future classroom. And, obviously you want to follow all the laws. Doing this is, I think, actually pretty important because I'm more aware of these laws now and what's all involved in them. And you know your responsibilities. And I get into some of the responsibilities a little bit later. I've already talked about a few of them, about my responsibilities as a teacher personally. And then knowing the history of how these laws developed, how they evolved and changed over time, what the current mood is in terms of all of this. Then you have to understand student and parental rights. So what the parents are allowed to do, what the students are afforded, and then also letting them know what their rights are. Not just recognizing that they have rights and respecting those, but also I think letting them know that, hey, you're allowed to be involved here, or you're allowed to have this or that. I think that's something that is important to take away. And then understanding classification methods and placement procedures. So understanding, of course, each child is different. Every child is different. Even within the same classification bracket, every child is going to be different. But to have a better understanding of what characteristics typically go along with what label and kind of what you can expect. I mean, you can never fully be completely prepared, but you can be definitely better prepared. And then also how the placement procedures work, referral, and, pre-referral also. And we get into that coming up next, so let's just move on to there. So, talking a little bit about the teacher responsibilities, I'd like to talk about the pre-referral, referral, assessment, all of that, because this is where teacher responsibilities really come in and are really important. So, pre-referral. This is an important step. It occurs before any referral is actually facilitated, and it's basically observations. And it's that stage that I was talking about earlier, where you see something, notice something, you're like, maybe there's something going on here, I don't know. And it's preemptive. And it's done to avoid unnecessary referrals. And that's for the benefit of the student, and I think also for the benefit of the teachers in the school as well, just to if there really isn't a disability taking place, you don't want to have to go through an entire referral process and get the parents involved in everything and have the student go through all of that if there really isn't a need for it. That being said, if there is a need for it, then action needs to be taken. So the school personnel, it's a collaborative effort. And then the parents, since this is so early on, the parents are typically not involved in this step. This is really, like I mentioned up here, it's a preemptive stage, preemptive actions. But, like I said, again, this can lead to an actual referral. So let's talk a little bit about that. So, referral. It's a request to evaluate a student for special education prospects. And this is how you get that IEP process started. So, the referral can be initiated by a number of people. It can be initiated by teachers, administrators, parents who are just concerned, or some other relevant individuals within the school. And I put down here 75% of referrals end up in special education placement. So about 25% don't actually pan out. So I think that's why that pre-referral stage is so important, because, if you didn't have that, then I'm sure the number would probably be lower and there'd be a lot of unnecessary paperwork. So the referral forms themselves vary in what they look like, but in all cases, pertinent information is written down and it's distributed to a committee to review, and the members of the committee can include teachers, school psychologists, administrators, so on and so forth. It's that multidisciplinary team that we mentioned earlier. And then parental permission must be attained before testing can begin. That's really important. And I believe the textbook mentions this. It's really probably a good idea to get to talk to the parents before the referral process is even started, just to include them and let them know what's going on. But definitely before any testing is taking place, it's by law you have to inform them, let them know what's going on and everything. So the actual assessment, I put down here, it's a way to collect data about the students and make decisions based on the results. I think it's as simple as that. And it's, like I said before, multidisciplinary team is required by law to partake in these assessments. And one member must be a teacher, so that's important for teacher responsibilities and what we're talking about here. So the assessments test students' broad development domains as well as areas of specific concern. So the reason that they were referred, that would be the specific concern. And then multiple tests are required. I think we mentioned that earlier. And this can, this leads to hopefully an effective IEP or IFSP that can help the student and get out of them their full potential. So this is my last slide here. Last slide with content on it is looking to the future. So I believe the last thing that we're supposed to do with this assignment is to talk about our philosophy a little bit. So I put on here, students with exceptionalities are just as important as other students. And I think, that's a given, obviously. But I think it's really important to state that right off the bat, and to realize that just because they have a disability doesn't mean they're any less valuable, that they don't require any less attention. And then something that really stuck out to me during my research for this was the least restrictive environment. and how important that really is for not only the students with the disabilities, but also for the students without the disabilities. For the students with exceptionalities, this gives them an opportunity to participate in that general education curriculum with their peers. They're not segregated or anything like that. But then also, for the students without exceptionalities, they're exposed to different kinds of students that have these disabilities. So, they might not become experts in these disabilities or what goes into them or anything like that, but they're going to be exposed to them. They're going to be more, for the future, they're probably going to be more accepting. They are going to know a little bit more just by proximity, and be more open and more loving. Students with disabilities, for them, won't just be like an abstract idea. It'll be somebody that they actually know and somebody that they're friends with, so they'll be more familiar with it. I also put down here, collaboration with faculty and parents is key. It's incredibly important. The parents, we've talked about this at length. The parents, they need to be kept up to date with everything that's going on. And these parents, they love their kids. They want what's best for their kids. They want their kids to succeed. And interacting with them as a teacher, you're going to gain so much insight, because these parents, they know their kids. And they're going to be able to bestow upon you all this knowledge about their kids that you wouldn't otherwise know. And then coordinating with other faculty members also, they're going to be able to help you out. Maybe they've been there for longer. Maybe they know the student. They've had the student before. Maybe they're just involved in the IEP. So there's a lot of collaboration that goes into this to make sure that the student is getting the best education possible and the most appropriate education possible. And then I put on here, students should feel loved. No matter what's going on, the student needs to feel like these people actually care about me. Hopefully they're getting that from their parents at home, and then best case scenario, they're going to get it from their teachers also at school. And then last but not least, I've got down on here, students should know about their potential to succeed. And I think that's a great way to close this presentation here. The students, despite any disabilities, they need to know that they can still succeed. It might take them a little bit longer. They might have to do it in a different way, but despite that, they can succeed, and they can do it. And I think really everything that we've been talking about in here kind of leads to that. Students can succeed. They also need to know that, students can succeed, but the student themselves needs to know that. Excuse me. Sorry, you guys. I'm getting a little bit tongue-tied here. That's really the end of my presentation here. I have one more slide here that's sources. But that's pretty much all the information I have. Thank you guys for listening. I don't have a timer on here, so I can't tell how long my presentation has been going on here, but I know it's been going on for a while, so I'll let you guys go. Again, thank you for listening, and have a good rest of your day.